Hello everybody and welcome to this conversation about physical boundaries with myself, Rachel G, and Letty Coach. Hi Letty, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Hi everyone. So very excited to be here for this new topic.
Yeah, it's our
Go ahead,
second
please.
episode of a series on the topic of personal boundaries. And because it's a very broad and complex topic, and because we want to give personal boundaries the attention that it really deserves, we decided that we wanted to break it up into several parts. So last week we did actually kick off by covering what boundaries are, how we begin to form or not form boundaries in our childhood, and the different types of boundaries and the emotions and those needs that underlie those boundaries. So if you haven't already watched that video, then we do highly recommend listening to that video, as today what we're going to be talking about is a little bit more in depth on physical boundaries. Now, we set physical boundaries really to protect our space and our body and our right to be touched and to have privacy and to meet the physical needs such as resting and eating. Now, a physical boundary is clearly defining to another that your body and what personal space belongs to you. So let's say that someone goes and sits uncomfortably close to you, and to enforce your physical boundary, you can do one of two things. You can either choose to move away, or you can speak up and let them know that you just need that little bit more space between them and you. And another example of this is when someone maybe keeps touching your hair and you really don't feel like you want to tolerate that, and maybe with the exception of a hairdresser, you need to speak up and just inform this other person that you really don't like your hair being touched. So we need to remember that boundaries are learned, but if your boundaries weren't valued as a child, then more than likely you won't have actually learned that you have boundaries, let alone know that you are entitled to them. So what you learn in respect to boundaries is also very much connected to culture. Letitia, maybe you got something to say about the cultural differences.
Yeah, thank you. As we have said previously, and you beautifully said, boundaries are that set of rules, guidelines, and limits that are established by an individual first to determine our own visible and invisible circle of protection, within which there is me and outside others. And then how others may or may not interact with us so that this circle of protection is not violated, and what kind of response we will have it if it's breached. Therefore, we have the personal boundaries, the one that you were talking about, the physical in this case, which are those that we set ourselves. But there are also cultural boundaries that are determined by the society in which we grew up. These are boundaries that are difficult to discuss because unless you find yourself traveling and living in different parts of the world, because they are parts of those rules that have been taught to us since birth, we just assume those are our truth, our way to set those physical boundaries. An example of these cultural boundaries are the different ways of understanding distance between people during social interaction. I'm not referring about this period of COVID where, everything has changed. But in my case, for example, I grew up in a culture, the Sicilian one, where the distance between people is quite short. While in the American culture, on the other hand, you have to respect a distance at least 3 feet so as not to invade someone else's physical space. Mm-hmm. There are other examples, difference in what may or may not be appropriate for different culture is greeting. In some culture, we greet each other with a kiss on the cheeks, and we don't use the hug because it's considered a very intimate thing. In other culture, however, kissing is considered invasive and hugging is used. Then there are other cultures, and I'm referring to the Asian one, where physical contact is off limits and bowing is used. So this seems like unimportant details, but try using your own method of boundary setting in another society, and you are sure to realize that you could run into several problems. So whether it is personal or cultural boundaries, they are the basis of our relationships. And it's through boundaries that an exchange of learning and teaching about the nature of one person and the other one takes place. What do you think?
Yeah, we kind of discussed that in our very first video, how life on Earth is one big classroom, and how there are times when we are just playing that role of the student, or at other times we're playing that role of the teacher. And in respect to the boundary settings and boundary violation, of course, then we are very much in that role of being the student. Because we're in the process of actually trying to practice to maintain and enforce them. But once we kind of got that confidence in maintaining and enforcing them, then we tend to move more into that teacher role, because then in fact what we're actually doing is we're teaching others how we want to be treated, and teaching others in the respect of, you know, having a healthy relationship with us in terms of, you know, how close they may or may not get to us, what kind of physical touch is acceptable and unacceptable, and also our privacy, you know, how much we need, and also how much we wish them, or how we want people to behave in our personal space. So as far as violations, I think that's maybe a good little topic now to sort of dive into. What are they? Well, violations really are, you know, if you receive an inappropriate or unwanted touch, then this is a violation. If you are denied your physical needs, such as being told to keep walking when in fact you're feeling tired and you just want to take a break and stop and have something to eat or drink, or somebody is entering into your personal space in a way that is uncomfortable. Maybe that is like, you know, somebody coming into your room without permission. And also maybe somebody scrolling through your phone without any permission. Violations vary on a spectrum from mild to severe, with the most severe violations really resulting in kind of a serious physical abuse or neglect. But what I have found interesting over the years is that many of my clients, they tend to attract people or relationships into their lives who really have an opposite boundary to them. I found this also with myself personally. What are your thoughts on that, Letitia?
Yeah. Well, before we talk about weak boundaries and rigid boundaries, I would like to focus on a category where millions of people are victims of domestic violence, and I'm referring to children. Unfortunately, they are innocent beings who are totally dependent on their caregivers or parents. And just recently, I finished my training in the developmental trauma, and the numbers of cases of physical violence against children are aberrant. And it's all because children are considered our possession. And as such, we can do whatever we want with them. And I know that there is another category, which are the women, but I don't want to dwell on this one, because even though I know that there are so many cases of domestic violence, because whatever situation they are experiencing, they are still adults. So they have a degree of independence that the kids don't have, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So now going back to what you were asking to me, I just want to say that whether there are situations that they are much calmer of the ones that I mentioned before, any family situation affects a person's concept of boundaries. Boundaries, the healthy ones, being another way of referring to the degree of protection we establish in our interaction with others, where this do not stand on the pillar of trust towards ourselves and others, they can become rigid or weak. And so when it comes to adults relationship, we feel drawn to what sounds familiar. We do this unconsciously. We don't do it consciously, even if we consciously tell ourselves that we will never ever want to relive certain behavioral patterns. Let's take the example of a family situation where one of the parents was in a state of enmeshment. So enmeshments where there are no boundaries, where there was no point where the parent ended and the child started, and vice versa. So this state where the child was feeling totally one with the parents, or the parent was feeling one with the child.
Yeah.
So in this case, the child's internal response to this type of behavior is generally a state of suffocation from which he protects himself by establishing rigid boundaries. I don't know if you can follow me on this. And so what happened is that it might seem a little bit controversial or absurd, but it isn't, is that when these children become adults, they will attract the kind of partner who is somewhat familiar with the family environment experienced as a child. And in fact, the latter will attract a dependent and needy person with the same swallowing style as the parent. On the other hand, those who had, as a child, have experienced the sense of abandonment, neglect, the lack of importance of their needs and values will attract in adult relationships a partner with rigid boundaries, centered on themselves and emotionally unavailable to avoid. They do it because they want they want to avoid losing their inner control. And in this case, the person with weak boundaries will continue to do everything to be seen, cared for, and loved, fearing the imminent abandonment. And in the rigid boundaries of the partner will retrace their sense of little value already experienced as a child. So if you notice that's why they attract them, the opposites, because they are just reliving what is familiar to them. And I could dwell on this topic for hours, as the examples cited are typical of the relationships of the codependents or love addicts and love avoidance. However, I believe it is time to give some advice on how to establish healthy physical boundaries. Do you want to talk about it, Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, let's give some tips here. So, I mean, clear communication obviously is really important in this, and speaking your truth is a absolute must. I mean, we have to remember that our partners can't read our minds. So if you don't speak up, then when you're upset, then there's not really any way for them to assume responsibility or change their behavior in a situation. And I also greatly believe that when we silence ourselves, we are in fact basically violating also ourselves. And it's always good to remind yourself that everyone is unique. They are individual with their own values, their beliefs and understanding around boundaries. And so, I do believe that it can help us to then, if we remind ourselves of that, to take responsibility to communicate ours. And so really to get you started, there are kind of 3 steps that you can start doing. One is to create it. And what I mean by that is actually define what it is that is good for you and what is not good for you. What are the changes that you do want to make? And think about your why. Why do you want to create boundaries? And really get honest with yourself. What is it that you're trying to move away from? And what are you trying to move towards? What feeling are you wanting to experience here? And then the second part of that is then you need to speak it. You need to actually state what it is that you need. If it's like, for example, that you have a mother who's always contacting you, is always, every day, and it seems to be she contacts you, I don't know, 6 times a day or something, and she expects you to always be available at the drop of the hat, think about sharing with her your why. You don't have to, but it's good to try to explain, not over explain, but give a little explanation as to, for example, with the mother example, I have so much going on in my life, and there are so many days when I just feel exhausted and I just, I can't fit everybody in. And so, I need to start doing some things that are just for me. And so I can't always be available to you in whatever capacity that might be. But it's really important at this point to separate yourself from the reaction that the other person's going to give you, because it's not really your responsibility to take care of what somebody else is feeling. But know that whenever you're trying to implement a change for yourself, that the person that is being used to whoever's been, you know, your how you've been showing up in all the years prior are going to also find it difficult to kind of adjust to this new you. So just bear that in mind. And then the third part is, and the most important part probably, is that you need to uphold this. It's a critical part of the process, because what can happen is you very quickly can fall back into the same way of being, because the other person is doing or saying things that, you know, bring up guilt. But you need to just respect how you feel and be okay with the fact that you're having these feelings, and just stay on course. You know, remind yourself what your why is. Just know that being this new you is not going to be easy. But don't take all the comments and the remarks and whatever that are thrown at you personally. And secondly, for me, my own personal journey is, you know, working on the relationship with yourself. I think it's crucial. Physical boundaries will fail unless they are supported by these strong internal boundaries and a foundation of really self-trust, which we commented on in our first video. You know, we need these internal boundaries to protect our inner worlds. So when you have a healthy internal boundary, they will help you regulate that relationship that you have with yourself. And with a healthy dose of self-discipline and that management of your time, your thoughts, your emotions, behavior, and any impulses, it will, without a doubt, have a huge positive impact on how you set and maintain and enforce these physical external boundaries. So I would advise to, you know, watch out for a future video where I'm sure we're going to cover the mental and emotional boundaries, which are really much more related to this part of the internal boundary setting up. So do you have any further tips, Letitia?
Yeah, and I would just like to point out that when we are talking about internal physical boundaries, we can relate it to them in the aspect of trying to listen what's going on in our body. So if our body is asking us to rest, to go have a nap, to eat, let's do it instead of just not listening to it, because it's like we are not setting those boundaries where our body is important more than anything else. So as you were saying, like really, if you don't establish those boundaries and if you don't respect your own physical boundaries, it's likely that the others will do the same to you outside. So yeah, then after that, I would just like to have a little bit of advices for the two cases of weak boundaries and rigid boundaries. For those with weak or no boundaries, they can be strengthened by starting to pay attention to their physical sensation, back again to the body, my lovely body. Only in this case, they can recognize the alarm signal that the body is sending when that invisible circle of protection is crossed. Because let us remember that perhaps psychologically, we will not have learned how to establish healthy boundaries, but our body is on its own and knows exactly when a violation of its boundaries occurs and send us signals that generally correspond to a state of discomfort. So maybe if you want to start strengthening this kind of boundaries, so listen and ask yourself, how intense is the state of discomfort? We know that the person with weak boundaries doubts their own worth and struggle to say no for fear of not being liked or not being pleasant or not being lovable. But it is not that weak boundaries is not the way to attract people who will love them. It's the opposite. So therefore, it may be difficult at first to establish healthy boundaries when they are in the middle of a situation. And in this case, they can try to practice outside of these situations. The first way of saying no is verbal. in an assertive and grounded way. So if someone is trying to approach you in a way that where you start feeling this physical sensation of discomfort, you can just say no verbally in a very assertive way by aligning the body language with what you are saying. So no smile, no, no, in this way, because you are not, the other person is not getting the concept of no, okay? If the verbal part is not working, as not being successful, then move on to the physical distancing and extend the arm in front of you just to say no. If the person still get close to you, then in this case, or you remove yourself from where you are, or you ask the person to leave. So when someone is getting too close to you, listen to the physical sensation. Verbally, the first parts can be just, please keep yourself a little bit more distant. Please, I do not like you to touch my hair. You can just say like that, and no smile within that. The person still keep on doing it. So just remove, distance yourself, step back. Third step, doesn't listen, just remove yourself from the situation and just ask the person to leave. And because of, the situation can be quite escalating if someone doesn't respect you. So there are extreme situations when you can ask if it's possible help to someone else. For the people with rigid boundaries, I would say that the advice is the other way around. So I will propose them to affirm to the other person if they feel that the person is getting too close to them. So try, instead of getting yourself behind these walls that you build, try to say to the person how you feel and ask the person to respect your physical space, knowing that this doesn't mean lack of love or lack of interest in the other person. So, but just you can be assertive, but at the same time, by letting the other person knows how you feel, that is already a step that puts these walls a little bit lower and create a healthier relationship. So from my side, these are the tips. I don't know if you want to say anything else, Rachel, or you just want to add something else?
I think that's wonderful information that Letitia, really super important. And I think that, the takeaway here is really your body has the answers, right? Listen, it will tell you yes or no, depending on the situation, what feels right for you. So yeah, it's good. Your body is your temple. Look after it. So anyway, let us know, guys, if you've had any experiences with physical boundaries that you'd want to share, or if you have any questions that might have popped up in your mind whilst you were listening to what we've had to share today. We'll be happy to answer and give you a reply. So this really kind of brings us to the end of this conversation about physical boundaries. In our next week's conversation, we'll be exploring more in detail sexual boundaries. So we'd love to like and subscribe. And if you press on the bell, the icon bell, then you will be notified of our next up and coming video, certainly in this series on personal boundaries. So thanks a lot. Thank you, Letitia.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thanks our audience to watch our video. We hope that you liked, and see you next time.
Yeah.